The Mediterranean Sea, sometime between the 3rd and the 2nd millennium before the birth of Christ. Historic books, written then like the Iliad and the Odyssey, told stories of brave heroes, memorable deeds, and magnificent cities. The great civilizations of Greece and Rome which followed were inspired by these mythical tales. They recognized their own forefathers in the early heroes, but they could never see the wondrous cities described in the books. They had all been destroyed and abandoned, or been swallowed up by sand or water. Cities such as Ebla, Troy, or Mycenae existed only on Homer's pages. But guided by the books, explorers went out and found them, unearthing extraordinary historical evidence and priceless treasures. Now, thanks to modern technology, we can visit these legendary places and follow one man's dream to uncover the civilization of heroes. Fascination with the past and the desire to know about our predecessors has been with us since the dawn of history. The ancient Greeks and Romans also loved to find out about their forefathers. Their attention was concentrated on the cultures of the 2nd and 3rd millennia BC. Among the civilizations that most interested Greek and Roman historians were Egypt along the Nile, Assyria and Babylon on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and also the pre-Hellenic societies of Greece. These were the Minoans of Crete and the Mycenaeans in the Peloponnesus, who inherited their empire. The allure of Egypt always exercised a strong attraction. The age of the pharaohs had long faded by the 2nd century BC, but the monuments of that glorious past were still to be found everywhere. Inscriptions carved on walls and obelisks told of great feats and arcane rituals. Historians were particularly fascinated with the pharaoh Thutmose III, whose history was carved into the columns of the temple at Karnak. Thutmose had mounted a great military campaign to conquer the Near East in the 15th century BC. When he arrived, however, he found that many of the ancient Babylonian cities on the Tigris and the Euphrates had already been reduced to ruins. Of those ghost cities, one in particular has maintained an irresistible hold on historians: Ebla. Ebla was a legendary Assyrian city north of the Euphrates and the capital of a powerful kingdom. But the ensuing centuries buried it in sand, erasing all traces of the settlement from the face of the earth. Apart from the inscriptions at Karnak, all that remained of Ebla was a mention in the Bible. One day in 1973, some Syrian farmers were working their fields when they unearthed a magnificent bas-relief. The discovery attracted an archaeological team from the University of Rome, which dug up pottery, utensils, and the torso of a statue bearing a votive inscription that clearly bore the name of the city. Ebla had been restored to history. But the most sensational discovery came in 1975, when the Italian team found 17,000 cuneiform tablets dating back to 2300 BC. Once translated, they were discovered to be commercial contracts and legal documents. Paradoxically, that immense hoard was preserved because of a violent act of destruction. About 2300 BC, the city was sacked by King Sargon of Akkad. The tablets had been stored neatly on shelves in the palace archives. The palace collapsed in such a way that the tablets were stacked tightly on top of each other, a position which kept them intact and allowed the Italian archaeologists to reconstruct their content. Ebla was a big commercial centre in Syria, and its king was a rich merchant. Trade was vital. Caravans preparing to leave for the Orient or for the Mediterranean were invited to lodge at the palace. These caravans were the arbiters of the city's fortunes and kept its king in power. If they went west, they would make their way to the sea. From there, ships transported the cargo to western lands and picked up trade goods for the return journey. Some of the goods traded were fine pottery and art objects, and also metals to make weapons and armor. Crossing the Mediterranean, however, was hazardous. Whoever owned the biggest ships and biggest fleets controlled the seas, and for a long time, it was a ferocious people notorious for piracy who dominated the Mediterranean, the Mycenaeans. Between Mycenaean Greece and the Orient, there was a city that preyed on ships sailing up the Hellespont to the Black Sea. This city was Troy. The Mycenaeans fought a war against Troy that's captured the imagination of the whole Western world. Troy, once known as Ilios or Ilion, was a thriving Hellenic city. It's proved one of the most beguiling challenges to archaeologists. Many have dedicated their lives to searching for it. But it's not been easy to rouse King Priam or the beautiful Helen or the brave Hector from their obscurity. Troy, the city whose siege was described so eloquently in perhaps the world's most famous book, Homer's Iliad, could have been located anywhere. In 1868, a German archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, decided to invest all the money he'd earned in business to pursue his lifelong dream, to discover the actual places where the heroes of his youth had fought. The Iliad was certainly not an exact scientific work. Before being written, about the 5th century BC, it had been handed down orally through generations of storytellers. The epic related events that had happened hundreds of years earlier, yet Schliemann decided to put his faith in the text. Many archaeologists were hunting for Troy, and they were digging on this hill known as Bunabashi, in an area between the Turkish cities of Çanakkale and Ezine. Schliemann, however, was not convinced. He combed the Iliad for new clues. Homer mentioned two rivers, the Scamander and the Simoentor. The battles took place around a fortified citadel built on a natural rise in the ground. These details may have been figments of the author's imagination, but Schliemann chose to believe him. This hill, Hisarlik, was quite similar to the Homeric description. It was here where Schliemann started to dig, and in the end, it was here where he found Troy. 9 different cities, one built upon the ruins of another, emerged from the excavation. The second layer yielded amazing treasures: cups and vases, weapons, gold jewellery and buttons. Schliemann thought he'd found King Priam's treasure. We now know that these were not the property of the Trojan king. Modern archaeology, based on rigorous scientific methods, has dated the objects to several centuries before the Battle of Troy, attributing them to a dynasty of the 3rd millennium BC. But Schliemann was convinced. His belief was supported by the evidence of fire in the layer where he found the precious objects. Homer had said that Troy was burnt to the ground by the Mycenaeans, who entered the city after a 10-year siege, thanks to the stratagem of the wooden horse, which now stands in replica on the site. Schliemann thought that the city attacked by the Mycenaeans was the same fortified city he'd excavated, laid out in this plan dated to the 3rd millennium BC. But this city, surrounded by a wall barely 122 meters across, could hardly have stood up to 10 years of siege, nor been big enough to house Priam's extended court. According to recent studies by 2 archaeological teams, in the 2nd millennium BC, the time of the war, Troy was encircled by these much more extensive walls, and they probably were further extended and fortified towards the end of the 1st millennium BC. Relying on descriptions in the Iliad and taking into account recent digs that have uncovered new parts of the city, we can now relive the legendary Siege of Troy. This is what the Mycenaean soldiers would have seen when they landed in force from the sea. The sight of a menacing fleet approaching Troy was probably not unusual for its citizens. The 9 layers that were found at this site correspond to 9 different cities, testifying to many cycles of destruction and rebuilding. We know that Troy, in addition to being strategically important in the control of the sea routes, was the foremost producer at the time of finished and semi-finished gold objects. And so it's no surprise that it attracted the greedy attentions of its neighbors. The conquest of Troy meant not only not having to pay taxes on merchant shipping going to the Black Sea and the Orient, but also taking possession of the gold reserves. And so it was primarily economic motives that drove the Mycenaeans into war, while Homer's account of the beautiful Helen and the courage of heroes like Achilles and Hector has enriched the story with drama and romance. Troy was an extremely wealthy city, appropriately defended by massive walls and extolled by Homer as invincible. That's the reason, after 10 fruitless years of siege, why the Mycenaeans came up with the expedient of the wooden horse. Troy was destroyed and rebuilt 9 times, the last reconstruction occurring during the time of the Romans. One of the grandest versions of the city was created by Alexander the Great. The noble deeds of the Trojans against the Mycenaeans were so vivid in the young leader's mind that he made an offering of his armor to the goddess Athena, who was widely venerated in Troy. In thanks, the Trojans presented Alexander with armor that they claimed was used during Homer's war. The historians Strabo and Plutarch both reported the anecdote that Alexander the Great always wore that suit of armor into battle, considering it to be his sacred talisman. In the 1800s, it was believed that this fortified city was of medieval origin. So archaeologists of that period never bothered to dig within its walls in search of evidence of anything older. However, the location and the enormous size of the walls attracted Schliemann's attention. He'd crossed through this area of the Peloponnesus on his search for Troy, and was quite struck by these enormous stacked masses located near present-day Argos. His mind was full of the myths learned in his childhood and the words of Homer, who made mention of only one Mycenaean city girded by walls, the legendary Tiryns, built by the giant Cyclops. Schliemann was inclined to take seriously the contents of the Iliad and refused to accept the idea that the gigantic fortress dated only to the Middle Ages. Those rocks inspired in him images of legends dating from the dawn of time. And there was also the Greek historian Pausanias, who confirmed Homer's account of the existence of Tiryns. Pausanias had even gone so far as to compare the grandeur of the fortifications of Tiryns with the pyramids of Egypt. So somewhere near Argos, there still had to be those walls. Such a fortress could not have simply vanished into thin air. And once again, his hunch vindicated Schliemann. At the top of the citadel, the ruins of an opulent palace were found, with frescoes in Minoan style dating to the 2nd millennium BC. It was the fortress of Tiryns. And once again, the violence of war was the reason for the preservation of the frescoes. The upper floors of the palace, collapsing into those below, had filled the rooms with debris. The fire, started by the invaders, then melted the outer bricks, creating a sort of shell that preserved the interior wall paintings in all their pristine glory. But who were the invaders? Who were able to destroy such a strong city protected by these imposing walls? Historians discovered that the winners of this epic victory were the Dorians, a people from the north who settled in Greece after driving out the Mycenaeans. The secret of their power was their weapons, which were made of iron, a material unknown to the Mycenaeans, who fought with more brittle bronze weapons. The courage and audacity of the heirs of Achilles availed them little. Their swords shattered as soon as they touched those of their enemies. One Mycenaean city stood out above all others, the city that gave its name to the great conquerors of Troy, Mycenae itself, a city described by Homer as having abundant gold reserves. Its monumental gateway, guarded by 2 lions, still inspires awe. This was the realm of the great king and the leader of the expedition that laid siege to Troy, Agamemnon. The intrigue surrounding the supposed location of a legend has always been a stimulus to archaeologists and the Indiana Jones in us all. Where was the tomb of Agamemnon? Did he really exist? Had Mycenae's gold been spared the ravages of time? Pausanias insisted that Agamemnon's tomb lay within the walls of Mycenae. But the city was surrounded by 2 sets of walls, an external one that protected the dwellings of the ordinary people, and an internal one to protect the citadel, which contained the royal apartments and public buildings. The search carried out within the external walls proved fruitless. Then Schliemann arrived. The archaeologist sank his shovel into the ground near the Lion Gate, inside the citadel. And he dug until the ground yielded, from a number of tombs, the glittering metal immortalized by Homer, 33 pounds of gold. Among the treasures was a number of marvellous gold funeral masks. These were certainly reserved for monarchs, and in the features of the most beautiful mask of all, Schliemann claimed to recognize Agamemnon himself. It has since been ascertained that the masks date back to a period prior to Agamemnon. The excitement of that find was so great, however, that no one has since dared to rename this piece. The finely embossed golden mask is still universally known as the Mask of Agamemnon. Schliemann had reached the heart of the Mycenaean civilization, the legendary home of its great king. And of course, a great king needs a great palace. Entering these rooms, recreated here according to Homer's description, we can see what a profound influence the Mycenaean culture had on the Greeks. The Mycenaean civilization handed down its own image to posterity, largely through its architecture. This room with the hearth in the center, called a megaron, is the heart of the palace and became the model for the most emblematic of Greek buildings, the temple. The king's house thus became the house of the gods. Mycenae was a city from which legends were created, as was Tiryns and the incomparable Troy. The legendary cities and the mythical heroes that inhabited them would have remained mythical if not for heroes of our own time, like Heinrich Schliemann, men and women who pursue their passions, expanding the knowledge that enriches us all. We follow the paths of the civilization of ancient heroes as an example to the possible heroes and heroines of today and the future.